Hello, and welcome to the 6th episode of my Counseling Skills and Techniques podcast and video series. My name is Dr. Amber Hughes. In this episode, I am talking about confrontation. When we first think about confrontation, or challenging skills as it's also called, it can sound really confrontational, right? Which seems to be the opposite of what we're trying to do in counseling. However, confrontation is an advanced counseling skill that is extremely useful when used appropriately. I want to start with a little clip from a segment with Bob Newhart, if you remember who he is. In it, he is playing a therapist demonstrating his go-to technique. I think that this is how we usually envision confrontation sounding.
All right, well, let's go, Catherine. I'm going to say two words to you right now. I want you to listen to them very, very carefully. Then I want you to take them out of the office with you and incorporate them into your life.
Well, shall I write them down?
Well, if it makes you comfortable, it's just two words. We find most people can remember them.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay, here they are.
Stop it!
I'm sorry?
Stop it!
Stop it?
Yes, S-T-O-P, new word, I-T.
So, what are you saying?
You know, it's funny. I say two simple words, and I cannot tell you the amount of people who say exactly the same thing you're saying. I mean, this is not Yiddish, Catherine. This is English.
Stop it.
So, I should just stop it.
There you go. I mean, you don't want to go through life being scared of being buried alive in a box, do you? I mean, that sounds frightening.
Okay, that cracks me up every time I listen to it. Now, obviously, this is done to be funny, but I do think that the word confrontation can be a little off-putting when we think of it as a counseling skill. So what is confrontation then? Confrontation can range from argument to debate to healthy discussion, just in everyday life. In counseling, however, it can look and sound very differently depending on your approach, your theoretical orientation, your personality, the client issue. So there's a lot of factors that go into what a confrontation looks and sounds like. And typically, in the counseling setting, confrontation doesn't sound very confrontational at all. Okay, so a lot of times, like I tend to use humor a lot when I'm counseling. So I'll use humor when I'm doing a confrontation. I'll make a joke. I might pull up information and just, so when I'm doing career counseling, a lot of times I'll have to use challenging skills when I have students who maybe want to do something that they're not, they don't have the skill set to do. So let's say I have, a student who wants to be a doctor, but he can't pass his developmental math class. So the chances of him going to medical school are very slim. And so I might bring up, the math classes that he would have to take in order to get into medical school. I might bring up admissions requirements and just show him that incongruency between where he's at and where he needs to be. And that is a confrontation, even though it's not a confrontation, if that makes sense. It's not an argument. It's not a debate. It's not even a healthy discussion. It's simply me pointing out these incongruencies. And that's what a confrontation is in counseling, is pointing out incongruencies. It's also bringing something to light that maybe wouldn't have been talked about. Or maybe solving a problem. So sometimes as counselors, we have to be the ones to talk about like the elephant in the room, or to point out that our client is acting in a way that's not going to get him or her where he or she wants to be. Those things that maybe in real life, I mean, obviously counseling real life, but maybe in everyday conversations, we would just let it slide, right? We wouldn't be the one to point out the awkward thing that, that that nobody wants to say. But in counseling, it can be really useful to be the one to say that thing. Okay. Confrontation is also a way to challenge a single perspective. So if you have a client who's very focused on one thing, again, going back to career counseling, because that's what I do. I might have clients who, I had one girl, and this was, I didn't do a confrontation here, but this would have been a good example of challenging that single perspective. She was a student trying to get into the nursing program when I was at the University of Tennessee. They took classes and applied to the nursing program, and she didn't get in. And she came in to meet with me. She was so upset. This is why I didn't, and I guess I did a little bit of a challenge too with her. But she was just really upset because she didn't get into the program. And upon talking to her, I found out that was her option, right? She was going to go to the University of Tennessee, and she was going to be a nurse. She was, oh God, they had a name for it. For students whose parents had also gone to the University of Tennessee. I forget what the name was. They called them something. Legacies. Yeah. And so when you had students like that, those legacy students, I think that was what they called them. They were just, they were passionate about the University of Tennessee. And she was so upset because she had this one idea of what she wanted to do and who she was going to be, and she didn't get into the program. And it was devastating to her. She was just really upset. And so I did do a little bit of a challenge, and I said, well, you have kind of two directions you can go. You can graduate from the University of Tennessee and major in something else, or you can look at nursing programs at other schools, which her GPA was good. It's just that UT's program is more competitive than like the local community college. And essentially, not essentially, it is, she could go to either and graduate with an RN to be a registered nurse. And so I did a challenge, but again, it wasn't confrontational at all with her. Now that I think of it, I said I didn't do a confrontation with her, but I did. I challenged that single perspective, but it wasn't confrontational at all. She was so upset. My gosh, I was, being really empathetic, and she was crying, and we were talking about it. And what I was doing was challenging that perspective. No, you don't have this one option. You have, multiple options here. At that time, I don't even think she was able to really consider her options. I think we maybe got to a place where she had decided she was going to stay at UT and then look at other majors. But she was just really too upset to do much talking. And so I think on two levels that gives you an idea of what a challenge can look like when it's not confrontational. It was so non-confrontational that I didn't even think about it as a challenge. But it also gives you an idea of what that single perspective can look like and how we need to challenge that at times. Now, in order to do a confrontation, you need to be able to identify discrepancies, okay, or those incongruencies. You're not just arguing with someone to argue with them. Basically, we have a purpose, right, an intention with our skills. And that's, what we always want to do is be intentional with the skills we use. So there's different types of discrepancies. We have internal versus external. So what we're saying or thinking versus or what we want to be, which is maybe different from our environment or is different from reality sometimes, like that example of maybe a student, again, sorry to use multiple career examples, but I had to use challenging skills a lot when I was doing career counseling with that student who, say he wants to be a doctor, and there's no way he's going to get into medical school. So there's a discrepancy there with, what he wants, what his goals are, and what the reality is. And there's more to it than that. right? It's not just a matter of skills. Sometimes it is just a matter of skill set, but sometimes it's also a matter of, really understanding what goes into being a pre-med student, right? There's a lot of studying involved. There's a lot of focus, and he just wasn't there. Wasn't putting forth that huge amount of effort that goes into preparing for medical school. When the verbal doesn't match with the nonverbal, and so this happens a lot, like with our, I think of it a lot with our feelings, or also behaviors. So, like, if you have someone who's visibly upset and they're telling you they're fine, clearly they're not fine, right? And so you might do a little bit of a challenge to point out that discrepancy. Well, you're telling me you're fine, but you're crying. You're telling me this really sad story, but you're smiling. And so pointing out that discrepancy can really help. And what it does is it helps to understand better what's going on, and it helps to get deeper with a client. We talked about those different levels, right? We have the thoughts on the outer level, and then we have feelings, and then we have meaning. And that's ultimately what we're trying to get at, is meaning. And we'll talk more about meaning next time. But doing a challenge can help us get to that meaning, right? Pointing out these discrepancies can help us get there. And then we might also point out discrepancies in a story. And this you'll have a lot, especially with certain types of clients. And I get students who tell me all the time that this is what really bugs them, is when a client's lying, right? They're lying to you, and what do you do with that? And sometimes you don't do anything, depending on where you're at with your client, but sometimes you do, and you can do a little bit of a challenge or a confrontation, pointing out discrepancies in a story. Well, you're telling me this, but you also told me this. For example, and this is kind of a one you might see, especially with, I'm thinking like adolescent girls. Nobody likes me. I don't have any friends. I hate my parents. They drive me nuts. And then the next minute she's telling you about how she went with her parents on vacation and they had a great time. Or she's telling you how she hung out with a group of friends the other night. So that might be a discrepancy you point out. Well, you're telling me you don't have any friends, but you also said you hung out with these girls last weekend. So tell me what's going on there. And then there might be some cultural discrepancies. These are important to identify. So you might have some things that you think are discrepancies that aren't. They're just the effect of culture, right? And then one that stands out to me is it's not really I guess it is a discrepancy. I said that with my other example, right? It wasn't a challenge, and it was. So I think this only happened once, maybe a couple times. I had a student who was, I don't remember where she was. She was from the Middle East, and she came to meet with me in a career counseling session, and her dad came along. And that never happens, right? We don't have parents, especially at the Career Center. When I was doing academic advising, especially during orientation with freshmen, a lot of times we'd have parents there in the room. But this wasn't that. She wasn't a freshman. I think she was a sophomore maybe. And she had already been on campus. But her dad came to campus with her to come to this appointment with her. And so that was really a difference in cultures, right? So especially in the college culture, the tendency is to say, no, we don't want to talk to parents. We want to talk to the student. It's her decision to make. And so I was able to kind of identify that this was a cultural difference. And in that first session, her dad talked for her. He talked to me and I talked to him, and she was not a major player in the discussion. I would talk to her, right? But oftentimes he would answer. She might nod or agree. And so that was kind of how the first session went. And I made the choice to to talk to the dad, right? I didn't exclude him. I didn't, sometimes, again, especially in college, kind of the college culture, the tendency is to say, no, I'm not talking to dad. I'm going to talk to the daughter. She's my client. She's who's here with me. But I included dad in the conversation, and scheduled daughter to come back for a follow-up session. She came back a week later. And dad didn't come. So it was, and this is, totally my interpretation, but he seemed okay with it then, right? He knew she was coming back for an appointment. It was almost like he just wanted to come and make sure she was being taken care of. And he was comfortable with her coming back by herself then. So it wasn't a matter of him talking for her or making decisions for her. It was a matter of him almost protecting her, maybe. And so that might be a discrepancy that's the result of culture that you don't necessarily need to challenge, but there may be times when you do challenge it as well, right? So if this had been an ongoing issue, she, I think, was born in America. Her dad had immigrated to America, and so you're going to have a lot of those kinds of discrepancies and inconsistencies when you have first generation U.S. citizens, right? And they're kind of straddling the line between our culture and their parents' culture. And so that can be an issue in and of itself that may or may not involve a confrontation. It's just something to be aware of and take extra consideration with, I guess, if that makes sense. Let's see. All right. Back to that pesky self-reflection, which is in all of this, right? So think for a minute, which domain, thinking about thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, would be the hardest for you to confront, if any, right? You may be fine. You may think you would be fine with any, or what topic might create the most discomfort in confrontation. And it's important to identify these because we're going to not confront sometimes when it's uncomfortable for us. But if we can identify those moments, if we can kind of say, yeah, I think I'm going to have a hard time talking about sex with a client. Now that I think about it, I would have a totally hard time with that. And that's, maybe one of the reasons why I went into career counseling. I just get uncomfortable thinking about it right now. And I would probably scoot through that conversation and jump to something else quicker than you can blink, right? But if I can, now that I know that and have thought about it for, 2 seconds, I would be able to at least kind of intentionally force myself to stay in the moment and stick with that conversation and then confront if necessary. And so you may or may not be able to answer these questions now, but it is something to consider, and it's especially something to notice when you get to talking and working with people. What makes you uncomfortable? What might you have a problem with? Maybe you're not really good with feelings, or maybe you're not really good with anger. And so if someone's starting to show some anger, you might quickly change the subject, or you might be scared even, especially depending on your clientele, When I worked at an alternative school as a school counselor, and some of the kids that I was working with were, they had, been in the juvenile delinquent center. They had a record. They were, had a record for being violent. And so, that, I wasn't uncomfortable necessarily, working with those students, but I was certainly more cautious, than I was with other students, and aware of maybe increasing anger. And so I certainly treated confrontations differently with certain clients. And so that's something to consider as well. But just think about it, right? Just think about it, maybe notice it, and it's on you, right? It's going to be on you to kind of work through this and make sure that you're not making decisions based on you, not making counseling decisions based on you, that you're making counseling decisions based on what's best for your client. It's kind of the ultimate goal here. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about a study done by Strong and Zeman. So they looked at one of Ivy's videos, the guy from the textbook. You know, he does the demonstration videos for you, like the ones that you see through MindTap. So that guy. They used his video, or if you haven't seen him, he does demonstration videos for the text. They used his video of confrontation to do a conversation analysis of a confrontation, which I think is kind of fun and cool that they're analyzing the guy who's teaching confrontation, right? I also really like conversation analysis as a form of research, okay? What I think about this is that, first of all, it's just super cool, but it gives a really good detailed look at a confrontation. Okay, so I'm telling you, hey, confrontation doesn't have to be a confrontation. It can be a lot of different things, but this like shows it to you. So conversation analysis is a detailed analysis of a conversation that is occurring naturally. To do this analysis, you need a detailed transcription that tells you everything, like every pause. I mean, you count it by the second, every everything. And then you try to make meaning from that talk, okay? So you're trying to understand what all of that means and what it does, because according to conversation analysis, everything we say does something, right? Every word we say, every pause, every so I'm saying right? What's it doing in this conversation? What's it doing in this sentence? So I use especially when I'm like presenting like this, to buy time, right? So a lot of times we use as fillers to give us time to think, okay? And that's what conversation analysis looks at, is what those details do in a conversation. They do something for us, or they do something for the discussion or the conversation, okay? If that makes sense. And now I'm trying not to say And what they found is that talking or conversations is interactional, right? Which we know from conversation analysis is a back and forth. It's not a presentation. Even with a confrontation, it's interactional. Okay, so this is the important part. So a confrontation isn't just you yelling at your client to stop it. It's an interaction between the counselor and the client. So you're constantly, as you're doing a confrontation, you're constantly getting feedback from the client and changing what you say or how you say it a little bit. So I'm going to read just a bit of the transcript they analyzed. Okay. So first is the counselor, okay? As part of that, of what we were talking, you did a couple of times mention that I'm a little confused about this relationship with Bo. I heard you say he wasn't a factor. And the client says, mm-hmm. And the counselor says, and then I heard that you, as part of this is, I actually heard you say you thought of going and visiting the state university, but the things that he said kept you from going. And I tried the best I could to kind of use the pauses and the sounds he made. But that gives you, okay, so if you noticed that Ivy, who is the counselor, he's actually normally a pretty direct person. So if you were able to watch any of his other videos, he doesn't talk like that. He talks a lot faster, a lot more direct, okay? This confrontation wasn't direct at all. He was really beating around the bush. You probably, and I'll post the actual article for you so you can read more of the transcript. But it's hard to even follow what he's saying because he's beating around the bush so bad, okay? There's a lot of pauses. There's a lot of ums and uhs. And I heard you, as part of this, he pauses and he stumbles and he changes the direction. And okay, so the point I'm trying to make is this doesn't sound like quite the confrontation that I think of when I heard the word confrontation. This sounds like more of a confrontation that I would actually do, okay? Because when I'm talking about something that's uncomfortable or that I think is going to that I think the person I'm talking to is going to take badly, I talk like this, right? And I think we all do that, right? If you have something hard to talk about, maybe with your significant other or a family member, you might say, we need to talk. I need to sit down and have a talk with you. That, just saying that right there, indicates to them that you want to talk about something serious, right? You didn't tell them you want to talk about something serious, but just saying we need to talk indicates that it's serious, right? And when we talk about something hard, we tend to use a lot of those. I think of them, and I don't think it's the actual conversation analysis word, but I think of them as like filler words. And he does that here. Okay, so as part of that, of what we were talking, you did mention, like, all those words he said were meaningless in terms of what they actually did. It wasn't until several seconds into the conversation that he brought Bo up even, right? So he's using all of these filler words to kind of soften the blow is what they do. They kind of soften that confrontation, and that's fine, right? That's fine whenever you're doing a confrontation. That's, what we use those words for. Okay, next I want to, and like I said, I'll post that actual article for you because I think it's super interesting. But next I want to mention the role of theory in confrontation just briefly. So different theories focus on different aspects, right? Like we talked about before. So if you're more cognitive, you're going to focus more on thought discrepancies. If you're more behavioral, you're going to be focusing on more actions. If you're more relational cultural, you might focus more on, culture or kind of systemic types of things. You also might seek different routes to problem resolution based on your theory. For example, like I'm thinking of Albert Ellis, the REBT guy. He's if you've heard him talk, he's like from the Bronx, from New York. He's super confrontational, just in his kind of personality, right? He cusses a lot, but that's his personality, and so it works for him. That might not be your route, right? It might be that you like I said, I use humor a lot. I joke, I tease. That's something that's more comfortable for me. And so that's, I think, kind of where your personality comes in and your approach, but also your theoretical orientation. All theories, though, have the goal of supporting and resolving conflict. So we don't ever just want to do a confrontation and then leave it at that. We want to resolve it before we move on, or certainly before we let the client leave. All right. Next, I want to talk briefly about the confrontation process. So the first step is to listen and to identify the conflict and the client's messages, discrepancies, and any incongruencies. Clarify and clearly point out issues to clients and help them work through the conflict. So however you're going to do a confrontation, really, again, it's a confrontation in a counseling setting is really more just pointing out these discrepancies, okay? You want to do a follow-up, especially with this skill, because it is really powerful. So you want to make sure that you listen, you observe your client, and evaluate the effectiveness of your intervention. You really want to do that follow-up to see how your client is reacting to it, because if they don't react well, then you want to make sure that you don't, like I said, you don't leave on a bad note. You want to make sure that you've done some work to reestablish rapport, because if you do a confrontation too early without having good rapport, it can like totally ruin the relationship. It can ruin it anyway, okay? So you want to be really careful with this skill, and you want to make sure you're doing that follow-up. All right, finally, I have an example for you. So we have Joe. He's a handsome 32-year-old man. He has a good, stable job. He makes a decent living. He owns his own home. His marriage ended 2 years ago when he found out that his wife was cheating on him. He is kind, he's soft-spoken, and you find him to be fairly sensitive. He comes to counseling because he desperately wants to meet someone special and establish a meaningful relationship, but has not been on more than one date with a woman for over a year. He is asking, what is wrong with me? Joe also has very poor hygiene skills. His breath is toxic, and it is apparent that he does not use deodorant. When he leaves your office, the odor lingers for several minutes. Do you tell Joe that his problem may be related to his personal hygiene? How would you feel about honestly answering his question? How would you introduce this issue? What would you say? So this is one of those issues that's kind of universally hard to handle in our, especially in our culture. We don't like talking about these things. We don't want to hurt someone's feelings, right? So how would you handle this? How would you go about it? So take a couple seconds and think about it. And you're going to, everyone's going to have a little bit of a different answer because your comfort level is going to be different based on, whether or not this is something that you've encountered before. So just think about how you might kind of set up this confrontation. All right, and to end, I want to say, as I wrap things up, I want to say how powerful this skill is when used appropriately. Okay, it's really useful, it's really powerful, and what you're doing is kind of literally helping someone shift their point of view or perspective or bringing things to light for them. However, when it's used too early, when you don't have a great therapeutic relationship built, it can absolutely kill your rapport with your client. This happened to me once for sure that I can think of. So I had one student who, this was career counseling. She came in, we did kind of the typical, she took an interest inventory and we did an interpretation of it. And then after we did the interpretation, I was kind of walking her through, we moved to the computer and I was showing her resources to do a little bit of research on her own, but continuing to talk with her, right, about her options. And I said something, and I forget, it's been years, but I forget exactly what the confrontation was about, but I certainly remember the result. And we had, we were talking, kind of joking around, and certainly, I felt like we had a good kind of relationship. But in career counseling, a lot of times it's kind of a one-shot deal. So I had just met her, literally 30 minutes ago. So as much of a relationship as we might have had, it certainly wasn't stellar. And she was talking about, I think she was talking about her parents and what they wanted her to do and what she wanted to do. And so I think I just said something like, well, it sounds like that's what your mom wants you to do, not what you want to do. It wasn't super confrontational. It wasn't anything. She didn't take it well at all. So this must have been something that was really bothering her. And we weren't at a place where I could say that to her. We didn't have the right or a good therapeutic relationship built. I challenged her a little bit on, what she wanted to do and versus what her mom wanted her to do. And she shut down completely. She shut down. She wouldn't talk. I wrapped things up pretty quickly then, and she left and never came back. So if you use it too early, or, in this case, it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't a real drastic confrontation, but she just wasn't at a place to hear it. So sometimes it's not just about, using it too early. Sometimes it's about where your client's at as well. Another time of when a confrontation went well for me, just to kind of end with a couple more examples. I had a student who, when I was an academic advisor, we had students who were on academic probation who met with us regularly through the semester. So I had one guy I was working with, and he had to meet with me 3 times. And I think he was on his second meeting, maybe. He might have come. I had a lot of them who came in more often, which was great. It gave me a really, so I had, and some of them, and I may have had him, some of them I had also had in class. I taught like a freshman seminar class. And so I had a lot of those students in class, or I taught a class 4 students on academic probation. So I got to get to know a lot of my advisees really well in a lot of different settings. So I remember having a really good relationship with this guy. He's coming in, he's telling me he's doing fine. So, so I'm kind of going through like our little spiel we had to do with him. Tell me about this class. What do you think you're going to get? Tell me about this class. What do you think you're going to get? He was taking, I remember the class even, it was sociology. And I knew, I knew the professor, I knew the class. So I'm like, so tell me, what do you think you're going to get in this class? Oh, I'm going to get an A. all right, well, I knew, by that point that they had had 2 exams. They had 4 exams total, and their final grade was based on just 4 exams. I said, okay, so what'd you get on your first exam? I failed it. Okay. What'd you get on your second exam? I got a C. Okay. And I think I confronted him several times now that I think of it in this session. So I said, an F and a C, how is that going to equal an A? And he said, well, I'm gonna get A's on the last 2 exams. All right, great. Then tell me how you're studying. How you would change up your study habits. Well, he told me what he was doing. I said, okay, so you've got, like a notebook with all your notes, and yeah, I've got a binder, and I've got all my notes in a binder is what he told me. I said, all right, he had his backpack there, and I knew he had just come from sociology. I said, all right, so why don't you get it out and show me? So he opened up his backpack. Oh my gosh, it was a mess. He had his binder in there, and he had his papers and his notes in there, but his notes, nothing was actually physically in the binder. The binder was just there, and then he had all his notes just shoved in the backpack. Like the backpack, I remember, like it looked like it was filled to the brim before he opened it. It was just bulging, right? But it wasn't filled with books or anything. He just had so many papers just shoved in there, kind of crinkled up and stuff, that it was pushing it out. And so I, again, here's where I used humor. I laughed and I teased, and I said, this is organized. How are you going to study with this? And so that was kind of a gentle confrontation throughout there, right? I'm challenging him, and I challenged him several times, right, throughout the way. And then we actually ended up calculating his grade to see what he was going to end up with in the class. So chances are you're probably not going to get an A. I know the class is hard. Let's say you get B's on the next 2 exams. Here's what your grade's going to end up being, but you have to get these B's. And then we organized his papers, put them in his binder, talked about study habits. So we were able to resolve that. He took it well because we already had a relationship. I used very gentle confrontations, used a lot of humor. We were laughing. I was teasing him. But it went really well, and we ended up having a very productive session. We got a lot of things accomplished. I got him over to, they had academic tutors who just helped with like study skills. So I got him paired up with an academic tutor who was going to help him with his study skills. And so again, it worked really well in that situation. So it can work really well if you do it appropriately and you make sure your timing's good. So the takeaway is use confrontation only when you are confident that you have a good relationship with your client, that you're able to clearly identify the discrepancies, and that you have time and ability to do that follow-up and make sure that you're kind of resolving this conflict before the session ends. So you don't want to do a confrontation at the end, right, of a session. You want to do it in the middle when you really have good time to kind of work through what you're confronting. All right? That's all.